think of it? Nobody. It's one of the biggest guarantees out there.
The following is a special presentation of KNX News 97.1 FM.
From the Audacy Sound Space on LA's Miracle Mile, this is A Generation Lost, a KNX News Town Hall.
Here are Mike Simpson and Charles Feldman.
Think back for a moment to 2020, March of 2020, the moment you heard that schools were going to be shutting down. You probably wanted to think it was going to be brief. A few weeks at most, that's what we all wanted to think, but that's not how it went. We know how it went. 3 years later now, it is clear. Maybe no group of people had it harder, saw more of their lives turned completely upside down than teenagers. They lost access to in-person learning, their social networks, sports, extracurriculars, basically everything that their lives had been built around.
And then there's the controversy, whether you consider all of this a public health necessity or an overreaction. The effect of school closures, well, that is indisputable. The country's children, they have fallen behind. Testing showing that 9-year-olds lost the equivalent of 2 decades of progress in math and reading. 4th and 8th graders also recorded steep declines, particularly in math, with 8th grade scores falling in 49 of 50 states.
And that's just the academics. Teens in this country have been described as being in a state of mental health crisis. We're going to touch on all these elements for this show, the complex ways life for millions of kids have been changed, turned upside down, all in the middle of a pandemic that was killing their friends in some cases, their family members, and throwing their families into all sorts of economic turmoil. We're going to start talking with some students about things and then some experts about whether we can fix it and how to fix it if indeed we can.
So, as Mike said, we are going to start by talking with the kids, excuse me for calling you kids, but the kids, who went through all of this and who are now trying to get their academic and their social lives back on track. So with us is Alex Belinsky, is a 17-year-old senior at the California School of the Arts that's in the San Gabriel Valley, right, Alex?
Yes.
Okay. Montserrat Hidalgo is a 16-year-old junior at Southgate High School, and Sarah Meehan is a 16-year-old junior at Chatsworth Charter High School. Thank you for participating in this. Alex, I'm going to start with you. Tell us a little bit about, as the pandemic started, and as the schools were locked down and you had to shift into being educated really at home instead of the classroom, what sort of things went through your mind, and was it a period of anxiety for you? I would think it would be, but you tell us.
It absolutely was. But I think to start off, we all thought, yay, it's a couple weeks off of school. It was to celebrate, it was a snow day, which we never get in California. So it was just a great break. But once we realized how long it was going to be, that really started to settle in. I think we all sort of had anxiety. And I think our teachers tried to help us with that. I remember, like, one of my math teachers, she did the Mr. Rogers intro she put on a jacket, put on her shoes, and all of that, all on Zoom. And my mother now calls her the Mr. Rogers teacher. But I think that everyone tried to accommodate it, and there were some breakout groups that we had where nobody just talked to each other. We all just sat there on mute. And it was, I think it was anxiety-inducing, but it was also fun and exciting in different ways.
Yeah, fun till it wasn't, right?
Exactly, yeah.
I'm curious, in the Zoom class, how much learning you feel actually went on, or give me a picture, because, I mean, did your cameras have to be on, or was it a bunch of black screens, and then you're like, well, is that kid actually here right now?
Exactly, yeah. I don't want to speak for them, but it was a lot of breakout rooms with no one talking, and, hey, anybody want to answer this question, with no responses. And usually I can call on this person, but then their excuse is, hey, my computer's not working. Hey, this tech isn't working for me. So teachers obviously try to accommodate everything, but it was a struggle to get people actually engaged.
Yeah, Sarah, Montserrat, did we have a lot of broken computers?
Yeah, I feel like when it came to terms of online school, teachers did try to encourage students to have their cameras on and participate through the breakout rooms, and I feel like it took a little while to adjust because there was anxiety and this was all new. But as time went on, people became more comfortable with using Zoom, and it became like our daily basis, daily school life, like our new normal for that while. And then people started to participate more and turn on their cameras, and you saw a shift from like the beginning of it to the middle to see how people were like able to adapt and participate more.
Sarah, different people, of course, experience things in different ways, and they come through it in different ways. So I'm wondering if you had to grade yourself on how you've come through so far this pandemic, which is still with us, but is certainly not at the peak it was before. How do you grade yourself, and maybe more importantly, or as importantly, what about friends of yours? Do they seem to be as well adjusted, because you seem to be, as you are? Or do some of them not have that experience, have a different experience, do you think?
I think I definitely had a very positive experience. I think now I'm definitely more set back into our normal or our new normal. And I definitely think that everyone else took it a different way. I know that at the beginning, like coming right out of COVID, I was definitely anxious, being around people, and just like, even with the mask, it was still very like anxiety inducing, having to think about like, oh, well, what if I do get sick, and what will happen when I do? Because eventually everyone did end up getting sick. So it was definitely hard at the beginning, but now we kind of got to that normal stage.
But you did say, I think, that some of your friends, some of the people you know, do not feel the same way as you do?
Yeah, I do know that some people were like super excited to, finally get back to how we are now. I think that I just wasn't one of the people who was all like, oh yes, I can go out, I can take off my mask. And I think it just took me a little more getting used to taking off that mask and being able to, sit right next to people without that 6-foot distance.
Do you think people miss that? Sometimes they think, oh, the lockdown school, the Zoom school was so tough, but then, okay, we're back, everything's fine. Well, it's not always fine when you go back. Did you feel like you needed more support actually easing back in?
I think there definitely was support. Obviously it was a really hard shift for everyone. I think it was a term of if people took that support, and also the fact that that support was definitely there, and we just needed to push ourselves to also ask for support. I know some people didn't want to ask for those mental health resources or really take advantage of sessions on call and through text and that kind of stuff. So,
Montserrat, I'm curious, what do you think about your school in the sense of, do you think that your school system served you well during the pandemic, or do you think that there were deficiencies in the way you were educated? And if so, can you talk about that a bit?
I think online learning was pretty smooth on my end. I know some students didn't have like that motivation to like open up their computer and get on the Zoom and that kind of stuff. I know some people slept through their classes. But for me, it was the push from my parents to be like, come on, this is something that we're going to have to get normal about. And it was also like, you have to continue going, because it kind of kicked in that we're not going to get out of this anytime soon. So.
Sarah, the same question.
Yeah, so for me, I finished 8th grade and then started my high school. So it was 2 different schools, but I felt like both of them adjusted and adapted really quickly and really well. I finished off my 8th grade year like pretty smoothly. It was the last few months, so it was pretty chill, had an online graduation. And then the start of my freshman year, my school was able to provide resources like hotspots and laptops for students who needed it. And since everything was virtual, I felt like that helped a lot. We like adapted to being virtual and online, and I feel like when it came to motivations, it's like knowing that this is still important. Like, oh, I started high school, so now I need like make sure my grades are keeping up, and like the school was able to like help us out with that.
Alex, same question.
So I go to an art school, and I'm an actor, and it's really difficult online to Zoom to do the acting classes. We did town with our own costumes that we made up and like backgrounds that we picked up at the school. So especially going to an art school, I think they adapted really well. Something maybe that was a bit of a struggle was the AP classes, because the AP couldn't accommodate the course load for Zoom. And when I was taking my AP class, we usually have 6 classes a semester, but we actually had 3 classes a semester, 3 in the first 3 in the second semester. And I think that little shortened amount of time and the same amount of AP class coursework was a big struggle for a lot of people.
So when that's happening and you feel yourself almost falling behind, what is going through your head? I mean, look, I said it on the air a bunch. I almost failed statistics. Like, I got real close to failing. I remember freaking out, like, how am I going to get out of this? And that was normal school. I wasn't on Zoom. What is happening when that's happening to you?
Absolutely. So panic attacks, a lot of anxiety. I remember having my first panic attack was right when the pandemic began because my grandmother was supposed to come over from Atlanta, and we didn't want her to come because obviously for COVID. And then the shows got canceled that we were having, and I just couldn't handle it all, and I had my first panic attack. And then there were multiple panic attacks after that and after that. So obviously, then that led to a hospitalization. So it was a big struggle for me in my mental health. But I think that was really one of the big outcomes, and then just trying to perform and trying to stand up to college standards was a big struggle.
Sarah, you're shaking your head. Why?
Oh no, I'm agreeing with her, like how it was like stressful.
But you didn't have that kind of experience.
For me,
or did you?
For me, it was my freshman year, so I took one advanced placement class, and it was like an introduction to high school. So it was stressful in that way too, like, oh, like this is a new normal. But I feel like with online school, the course loads were able to like adapt to all virtual, so we were able to manage it that way.
Any siblings, younger, older?
Yeah, so I have 3 siblings, an older sister, and then a younger brother and a younger sister. So we all had different grade levels of online schools. We're all going through like the same thing together at different stages in life. So it was really cool to see that.
I'm curious, of the 3 of you, how many, you have younger siblings, right?
Yeah, I have an older sister and
older
then
sister.
a younger brother and a younger
brother. How many of you?
Yeah, I do have one younger sister.
How much younger?
She's 3 years younger.
Okay, and Alex?
Only child.
Only child. So this question is really for the 2 of you that have younger siblings. Do you get the sense that they went through the pandemic differently than you did? Did they have a different set of problems? Did they have different emotional issues that perhaps you didn't have?
I think for my sister, she definitely had, I think maybe a shorter attention span. Mm-hmm. So I recall my mom like taking her to different settings every week, kind of like, oh, you can do your Zoom outside today. You can do your Zoom in the living room. You can do it in your room. You can do it in my room. So it was that change of setting for her that really kept her attention span continuing to, I guess, lengthen. And I do recall also that my sister, she wasn't like going into her, well, obviously, like how I was going into my high school year, mm-hmm. She wasn't doing that kind of leap in grade level. So I think for her, it was a little easier transition. And for me, it was definitely more that social transition that was a little harder going from middle school to high school.
Sarah?
Yeah, so for me, when I had a sibling in middle school and a sibling in elementary school, and I felt like with different grade levels, there was a different amount of work and different introduction. With my little siblings, I know with their work, because they were learning new concepts, sometimes I help them out, or my parents as well, in like, if there were any concepts they need more support with, we helped teach them. And since we all had our different schedules of our Zooms and our work, we were able to manage and come up with a schedule that was like controlled chaos in our house. So we were able to manage it.
Did you worry about the youngest one? I mean, school's hard enough when you're a little kid trying to learn the new stuff, but like, did she have the attention span, the youngest sister?
Yeah, I feel like it was an adjustment for her, like trying to do Zoom and work, but we always were there to help her out. See, like, oh, if you need help with this assignment, we can help you, and make sure that everyone was able to learn what they needed to.
Because Alex, you were, of the 3, you're the one who doesn't have any siblings. Do you think that maybe you can't answer this question, but do you think that it changed your experience? By that I mean you had, of course, support from your parents, yeah. But perhaps not having siblings in the house that were sharing the same experience that you were going through?
Absolutely. So around the time the pandemic started, my father got laid off, mm-hmm. And then my mother was laid off as well. So we were all 3 in the house just trying to spend time with each other, and it was the most amount of time I've had with both of my parents. And I was lonely because I am an only child. I don't have a sibling to hang out with. But it was such great bonding time with me and my dad, and luckily he got a severance package that was big enough so that we didn't have to worry about him getting a job right away. Yeah, it was a bit of a struggle getting along with your parents because you're all cramped in this. We actually just moved right before the pandemic, so the house was a little bit bigger. But it was still, you have to get along with your parents and seeing them.
Well, but this is all going on so that people who are listening understand. This is all happening. The issue with your parents and employment and the pandemic, this is all one thing on top of another.
Yes, absolutely.
That had to have been rough.
It was very rough, and like I said, I was having a lot of mental health struggles. My grandmother was also very sick at the time, so I was involved with trying to figure out how long she's going to make it, and it was just a thing on top of thing on top of thing, which eventually led me to get hospitalized at a psychiatric facility, which was some of the scariest point in my life, but I think was also really, really helpful because I was there and they gave me what I needed, which was, I think, medication at the time because it was like a 5-month wait for a psychiatrist if I wanted to get meds. So they were able to provide me with urgent medication and therapy.
Alex, you know, there are a lot of people, especially your age, who would be very uncomfortable, I think, talking about what you're just talking about. Why do you want to talk about it?
Because I want to be an advocate for people like me.
Okay.
I want to make sure that people know that they're not alone, that if they need help, there's resources to provide them. You know, we just made this new suicide prevention hotline number, which now is separate from the veterans number. And then we also are working, I have a counselor in my school, and there's also it's called the Wellness Center at my school, which is a place to go when you need a break mentally or physically. I was just in there today because I just was overwhelmed by a test, and they gave me therapies. They gave me like fidget tools to help calm my brain, and there's therapists there if I need them. So my school especially is providing me great resources, and I want people to know that there are resources for them.
You know, we hear all the time from all sorts of officials, and they always say, you know, the stigma's gone. You can ask for help. You can ask for therapy. But is the stigma still there? I mean, you must know so many people who, for whatever reason, don't ask. I don't need it. I can never ask. I'm ashamed about it.
Absolutely. I think that stigma is still there, and it's something that we all need to work through. And especially through the pandemic, the stigma is like everyone has it, so why am I important? Why am I special? Because I've seen autism. I'm on TikTok like every teenager my age. But there's the people that say, hey, take this test to see if you have autism, take this test to see if you have ADHD, and people that actually are realizing, hey, I might actually have these things, don't have a resource to go to talk to them. And they're like, okay, well then maybe it doesn't really real. I think the stigma is still there, and I don't know how to get rid of it.
I want to talk with all of you a little bit about the future, your futures. You know, experts that we've talked to, Mike and I, over the course of the whole pandemic, I mean, they keep saying, well, you know, kids are resilient, that they bounce back. How resilient are you, do you think?
I think we're a great example of bouncing back. I mean, we're here, we're talking about this, you know, I think we're the prime example of bouncing back. For my future, I know what I want to do. I know that I want to go into either chemistry or environmental science, and it's something that I've looked forward to my whole life. So the pandemic really kind of pushed me into being able to support myself. I know there was the help there, but I also had to keep my own motivation. So I think that's something that the pandemic really brought on.
Do you worry about your younger sibling?
I worry about her. Obviously, like every older sibling does. But I know that I'm there to support her. My family is there to support her. And I see that, you know, as she's in middle school now, she's able to come to me for things that she needs support in. And that's something that I find reassurance in.
Alex?
Sorry, what was the question?
Well, it's resiliency, about whether or not the experts who tell us, Mike and I, and others, about how kids are so resilient, they'll get through all this, they'll bounce back. Do you feel that you're resilient?
I feel like I'm resilient, but I feel like none of us are ever going to bounce back entirely. I feel like we're all going to, like you said, there were kids that were testing lower and lower in their age group. That's because we didn't get the education that we needed. And it's hard to replace that. And they were behaviorally as well. We had freshmen that were going around acting like third graders because, I mean, they didn't get the detention that they had in middle school. And, of course, nobody needed to get detention. Zoom detention was a little bit different, I have to say. But, yeah, so I think resiliency in that way is kind of hard, and again, socially as well. I mean, we barely had a chance to talk to each other. I mean, there was Zoom and there was FaceTime, but getting to know people face to face is a lot different.
How often did you see people in the thick of it? Because something I thought of earlier when one of you said, it was hard for some people to even get to class on time, and I thought, well, school was structure, right? As a teenager, I had to get out of bed at 6 o'clock to get on the bus. But if my school starts at 9 and Zoom classes at 9, well, I can get up at 8:59 and be in my pajamas, and I can be on TikTok most of the time. So without that, I mean, how did you structure yourself? And was that part of the making this work?
So I feel like when it comes to like creating structure with online school, that kind of goes into the resilience. Like it was like, oh, we have this new challenge, like it's now online, everything's online, so how are you going to handle it? So I feel like at first I was just like trying to find a way to adapt and find a schedule, and I found that once I had a fixed schedule, like fixed for the most part, then I was able to like find a new normal and like adapt and cope with this. Like, yes, I was able to sleep in, but I still try to get up early to eat breakfast and get ready for my Zoom, try to do my work, and then kind of have like a set schedule to like figure out what I was going to do every day. And I feel like since it was online, we were able to like try new things, do new hobbies. I know a bunch of people picked up new things to do at home. So filling that in towards the day and trying new things, it's a great way to schedule.
By the way, for those who are just tuning in, I just want to let you know you're listening, of course, to a very special KNX News Town Hall, Generation Lost, and we're talking to kids who have gone through the pandemic. A little bit later in our broadcast, where you will also be talking with a group of experts about what it holds for the kids who are here and for kids all across America. But now let me ask you, Alex, first. Do you feel as if you're part of a generation lost?
Absolutely. I think I heard my English teacher, who I loved, say that every generation is defined by something. A generation is defined by if you were alive in 9/11, if you were born during 9/11, World War II, etc., etc. And I think our generation is going to be defined by COVID. I forgot what the term is, but the pandemic defined us. We're the Zoomers. That's the term I'm looking for. We're the Zoomers. And we're here to talk about, and we've lost a lot of our lives. I know there was a whole special on ABC for seniors in high school that didn't get their graduation. They lost that ability. They lost their senior trip. And I think that we all have lost something. I actually haven't had a last day of school. My first last day of school was canceled by the pandemic. My second last day of school was canceled by the pandemic. Third, kind of canceled by the pandemic, but not everybody was there. Then
I'm going to stop you because I want to hear also from, because I see both of you guys have been shaking your heads listening to Alex. So Sarah, same question, because I am curious about that. Do you want to be, Alex was talking about that she thinks your generation is defined or is going to be defined by the pandemic. Do you agree with that? Do you feel as if you're defined by the pandemic?
I feel like the pandemic has a really big influence and it left a big impact on everyone's lives. And I know how it's like generation loss, but I feel like another way to look at it is, yes, we lost, but we lost together. And times when we go through things together, that brings us closer. And our generation became closer together because we all went through that same struggle and everyone was impacted in different ways, but we were able to come together and come back. And like now we have this somewhat new normal where things are going back to normal. So in a way, we'll never forget about the pandemic because it was what was so important, but we like learn from it, and it will always like have a piece of our lives. Like it's going to be with the pandemic, but we were able to go with it and bond over it together.
Montserrat, same thing.
Yeah, going back to how we said that our generation is going to be defined by the pandemic. I recall over Zoom, one of my teachers said, write down everything that you are going through today because this is like history. We hope that it won't happen again. But I also recall her saying, this is something you could put on your college applications. And in my head, I was all like, how am I going to put this in my college applications if everyone's going through it? Like, how is that going to make me stand out? But, I mean, I could see, like, maybe in my college applications, they're going to ask, how was your life during the pandemic? How did you overcome such a challenge? And now I know that I can overcome such a
Yeah,
challenge.
you can
because
put it down.
we're here. Yeah.
Yeah, and
I'm a Zoomer.
I can definitely speak to that because I'm applying to colleges right now. And there's a specific question like, hey, if you were affected by the pandemic, fill out this out and tell us your experience. So they say, hey, if your grades were affected, let us know, and we can help. We can consider that in your application. So definitely is going to be on the college application process.
All right. That's one of our next jumping off points, actually. Thank the three of you so much for coming in and sharing your stories with us. Alex, Sarah, Montserrat, thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
All right, next up, we're going to look forward to how students, teachers, schools can try and dig themselves out of this COVID hole. And while the next panel comes up, we're going to check in with the organization that helped make today's town hall possible. That's CalHOPE.
And Justine Fisher, welcome. She is the Community Director for the CalHOPE Schools Initiative Partnership. And I should say that this is a program that provides schools and students and communities with no-cost resources to support mental health and well-being. And Justine, you know, I think no one can argue with the notion that there's never been a time that is more urgent, perhaps, than now, especially for young people, right? In terms of mental health support services aimed at their age group. Can you tell our listeners and our audience why your organization feels or felt so important, that it was so important to participate in this particular town hall?
So CalHOPE, which is a part of California's Department of Healthcare Services, was created during the pandemic. In the very beginning, when there was so much, people were feeling isolated and helpless, and the scary thought about the not knowing, which is the scariest to all of us, CalHOPE began with a crisis line for people to call. And as we developed and went through the pandemic, there was noticeably lots of other challenges to face, and our eloquent youth explained so much about what they were going through. It was happening in our schools and our communities. And CalHOPE has always been under the impression that, you're right, this wasn't easy. It's going to have affected us as a society, as a culture, as a world in total, yet we need to move forward. We need to find hope, and we need to find resilience, and we need to figure out how, as we are as Californians, especially CalHOPE, to get through all of this. And so CalHOPE has multiple programs that are supporting all of this mental health and well-being, helping youth, helping adults, families, schools.
And Justin, how does somebody who is so inclined, how do they avail themselves of CalHOPE services?
Very easy. You just go to calhope.org, and it lists all the opportunities that are there, that you can, there's a crisis line. If you really need to talk with a peer, you can do that. If you need something more supportive, as some people do, there's that availability. It also sends you out to the organizational part that I'm part of, the CalHOPE Schools Initiative, which offers free, no-cost resources to our educators and our youth and our families to help them work and grow and develop so they're naturally healing.
Let me ask
from
one
this.
quick last question. What did you make of, you listened to the stories of the three kids that were here. What did you make of what you heard?
I'm going to say, I think, first of all, very proud of them for being able to come and eloquently talk about their experience. That is wonderful, and that's part of everything we should be sharing. I also will say that for everybody, it wasn't exactly the same. We might have all had a collective experience, but for some, the challenges were harder. For others, they had better support. The way that we want to make sure we are going forward is that anyone in our state who needs it gets the support they need so they can move forward and they can find their own hope and resilience.
Justine Fisher, thank you so much. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
So now we're going to talk about how we can try and dig ourselves out of all this, and if we can. And one of the factors, of course, is, as we just heard, the pandemic disruptions. They weren't the same for everybody, and they also exacerbated inequalities that were already there and that have been there for generations.
So we are talking with a group of people who will be at least partially responsible for doing the digging. Jill Baker is a superintendent of the Long Beach Unified School District, the fourth largest school district in California. Gary Clark is Director of Undergraduate Admissions at UCLA. Chito Cayón is Dean of the Business Department at Los Angeles Trade Tech College, and before that he had a similar post at the Los Angeles Community College District. And Sean Reardon is a professor of poverty and inequality in education at Stanford University. He has produced the most definitive research that documents the pandemic's learning loss and the widening education gap that was exacerbated by the school shutdowns. Thank you all for taking part in this town hall. Sean, I'm going to begin with you because of the study. Can you briefly tell us what your study found?
Sure. We gathered test score data from every public school and school district in the United States from 2019 to 2022 so that we could measure how much students fell behind during the pandemic and how much that varied across different places. And the key finding, I think, was found that the pandemic widened educational inequality. So the lowest income school districts in the country, in those districts, students fell behind by as much as a grade level on average. And in the most affluent school districts in the country, students often didn't fall behind at all or by less than a quarter of a grade level. And so the pandemic really had disproportionate effects on students in the communities and the families that had the fewest resources. And so I think while there's a sort of average learning loss, there's really a big story about how much it widened inequality.
And can I infer from that and from your study that therefore those kids who were in that gap, who did not fare as well because of socioeconomic conditions, that their ability to bounce back, I would presume, is going to be an order of magnitude more difficult?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think you asked earlier about resilience, and I think of that sort of bounce back or resilient as not just an individual characteristic, but it's a feature of our society and how much opportunity and resources do we provide for students to recover from the impact of the pandemic. And what I think the study shows is that we need to invest a lot more resources in helping the students in those most disadvantaged communities and schools recover from it because they're the ones who suffered the most from it.
When you dig in and you get some of those stories, what do you see? Is it that higher income families have more access to outside help, tutoring? Is it that some of the schools are different, the resources are different, wireless hotspots? I mean, we heard variances on all these stories as we moved through the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's some of all of that, but I think it's important to remember, which I think came through in the conversation earlier with the students, is that the pandemic affected not just kids' schooling experiences, whether or not they were remote or not, and whether they had good broadband access or something, but it affected their families. Their parents might have lost their jobs. Their parents might have gotten sick. So a lot of low-income families had sort of frontline service workers was what their parents do. And so they might not have lost their job, but they're much more likely to get sick, for example. Teachers were affected in those communities as well. Families couldn't afford private mental health resources in those communities the way they can in affluent communities. So it's a kind of a combination of a wraparound pandemic. The pandemic wasn't just a schooling phenomenon. It affected kids' lives in every way.
Jill, let me ask you this, since you're a superintendent of, as I said, the fourth largest school district in California. And as we said at the top of this broadcast, whether to open, close schools, all of that has become politically charged and it's polarizing. But I am going to ask you, in retrospect, do you think it was the right thing or the wrong thing to do to close the schools?
Yeah, I guess hindsight is 20/20.
Sure.
As we say, and I think given the circumstances at the time, it was the right thing to do. I think the students expressed very well the beginning of it, thinking that it was going to be a couple of weeks, and there might have even been some excitement for them. In fact, when we notified our schools, we had high school students that were clapping as they left the building, but that was really short-lived. When we didn't come back from spring break in the spring of 2020, I think it was really setting in, and when we couldn't operate all of the end-of-year activities, it really took a toll on students. But given what we knew at the time, the health conditions of the time, I think it was the right decision.
Would you do it again?
Let's hope we don't have to do it again. I became a superintendent as COVID was beginning. And so my entire career as superintendent, not my entire career as an educator, has been through this lens of COVID and recovery.
Sean, did we see a difference in the length of the at-home schooling versus other states that opened up quicker? And what was that, if we did see it in the end, now that we may know?
Yes. So it's a mixed bag. So you hear often that, closing schools was a mistake and it led to larger learning losses. And there's some truth in that, but also it's a very small part of the story. So even school districts that remained open all year through 2020, 2021 had sizable learning losses. The districts that were remote more of the year had somewhat larger losses, but everyone had losses. It wasn't the remoteness wasn't sort of the driving factor. It was one among many factors. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind, that even if we'd stayed open, we still would see kids on average falling behind.
Gary, what is the level? We're now starting to see kids who were, juniors, seniors in high school at the beginning of the pandemic, reaching that point where they're applying to or getting into college. What are you seeing at that level? Are you getting the sense that these are kids that are adequately prepared for a college experience or no?
Well, I mean, the short answer would be yes. I think they are prepared. I think certainly they've experienced unprecedented challenges with not only their educational opportunities that were disrupted during high school, but as we've talked about, kind of the personal experiences that students have at home with family and illness and death and loss and mental health challenges, which are very real. So I think colleges are seeing this really manifest itself in ways that go well above and beyond just grades they're earning in a class. I think it's really it's roommate challenges, it's socialization, it's dealing with some of the mental health that came with the lack of opportunities to engage in their education in the way that they typically did. And we talk a lot about kind of the impact of the classroom experience and being on Zoom and virtual and how that impacts learning. But I think another significant part of that was students had all of their engagement outside of class, whether that's extracurricular clubs, working, sports, whatever the case may be. That was stripped away from many of those students. And that is what really gave them a release and a way to really balance not only what they're experiencing in class, but what they're able to do for enjoyment outside of class. So I think colleges are seeing all of that manifest itself in our incoming students, and I think are having to really redouble our efforts to support students, especially in their transition into college, as to how to navigate things like roommate conflicts and how to navigate, learning in a new environment when there might have been some relative gap in the learning that they experienced in high school. So I think colleges are having to really step up, and I think we've done a lot of good things, but I think there's a lot of lessons learned from this experience as well. How do you start to redouble your efforts to handle that kind of stuff? And when you see kids coming in, and you've mentioned this other times in other interviews when we've talked about this or anxiety, depression, and it's so many people were already so close to the line anyways, and then this was the push that sent them over. So what do you do when we're always kind of living in that zone now? So many people are right there on the edge. Well, I think it's, as we were hearing the students talk earlier, and again, I would commend the students for doing an incredible job of telling their stories. I think it is students feeling more and more comfortable talking about the mental health challenges that they might be facing. But I think colleges have to be in a position to accommodate those challenges and provide support. And I think that's more resources put towards counseling and psychological services on college campuses. And again, really destigmatizing the idea of talking about the fact that you might have challenges related to your mental health. We need to work on doing that as a community and as a society, and then colleges need to invest to ensure that when those students raise their hand and say, I need help, I need some support, that we're there to provide that support. Because for many students, for their background, but especially for students that might come from low-income backgrounds where they don't have access to those kinds of services at home, the college campus might be the only place where they can get it. So we need to be sure that we're filling that space and providing that support where it's needed.
Cheeto,
Here we go.
There are two different issues, I suppose. They're interconnected, but they're two different issues. There are students who, the question is whether they're prepared for a college experience if they're coming from high school. But then there's also, not every kid wants to or should go to college. A lot of them want to go right into the world of business. Are they prepared for that? Are they prepared for the business world, which is in many ways harsher than an academic one?
I think what we've learned is since 2020, adaptability is the key. Mm-hmm. So yes, they are prepared and they should be prepared. In some ways, they were probably better prepared than the traditional community college system. We had a challenge deploying 100% Zoom learning format. We had to undergo certain protocols and reinvent ourselves just to make sure that we met the needs of the students. However, thinking back, we did a pretty good job. Not entirely everybody was able to keep pace. And this is where the challenges increase because we had all these students coming to our doors and then we were thrown into the whole Zoom world, right? In many cases, the students were asking for more than we could provide because there was that learning challenge on our part. And so now, 2-3 years later, we have learned. We learned the combinations that worked. But did we have it the very first month, March, April, May? I wouldn't say yes. But for right now, resiliency, as someone just mentioned before, that's a good word, but I would also add adaptability as well. Mm-hmm. Because I come from the world where I work with many, many corporations. We train a lot of workers, incumbent workers, and they need the skills. And now more and more people are asking for proof of adaptability, right? I teach for Loyola Marymount University, and one of the things that we emphasize to our students is that you have to show that you can not only know the technical content, but be able to work with others. You have to have the responsibility. You have to have the things that make teams work. That has always been said, but throw it into the whole 2020 world, it was more essential, right? Because it was a different world working in the Zoom life, right? Not only were you learning, but our peers, we were communicating with ourselves through Zoom, and some people just didn't know how to keep up. And that's where, as my colleague just mentioned, colleges needed to step up. Some colleges stepped up faster.
If you're just joining us, this is a KNX News Town Hall. It's called A Generation Lost. We're talking about the learning loss through the pandemic. We had some students up here with us earlier. Now we've got our panel of experts. Jill Baker, Superintendent, Long Beach Unified. Gary Clark, undergrad admissions at UCLA. Chito Cayone, just heard from him, Dean of the Business Department at LA Trade Tech College. And Sean Reardon, professor at Stanford. He's done a lot of research on the learning loss over the pandemic. Jill, when you hear Sean's study and it says, a grade level or 6 months for some kids or even a couple months, can you really actually catch that up? Because that's a lot of time. You can't get new coursework for everybody and say, hey, we're working all through the summer.
Well, we're working to catch students up in very strategic ways. We have had a significant influx of funds from the federal and state government and doing our best to put that to really good use. So one of the responses that Long Beach Unified School District made is to have a learning acceleration and support plan and to make very public the way that we were investing in our students' needs. That plan includes significant efforts around acceleration, starting with early elementary literacy acceleration. And I'll just pause there because I think about what the students expressed, both that there was such a variation in how students experienced the pandemic. And I also think about what was said around transitions. And so we think of phases of students and what their brain development is. So in our learning acceleration and support plan, we're thinking about how do we meet the needs of early learners and learning to read and getting those foundational skills differently than upper elementary students, differently than middle school students and high school students, and each of those is addressed in the Learning Acceleration Support Plan. Academics, social emotional wellness, we heard a student talk about wellness centers. One of our responses is to have a wellness center in every high school that was then expanded into middle schools, not just because of the ability for a student to walk into that particular, but because it opened them up to resources that were all around our community that they could also access. We saw 60,000 visits to our high school wellness centers, which is the equivalent of every student visiting 3 times. Although every student didn't visit 3 times, It's a pretty strong statement.
Well, I want to talk about school counselors for a second because it has a double meaning. And I remember back in my day, the school counselor was someone you went to, I think I went maybe twice in junior year, and they looked at my transcript and they said, yeah, you can go to college. You should apply to these maybe. And that was it. How do you have the workload set aside for them to help all these kids get to where they're going in this era, and then also do the other thing, which is actually counsel, which you're talking about? Because I think maybe students will see them still as the first way, which is, this is someone who tells me my transcript is in order and I don't ever talk to this person.
I think our counselors would say that is a challenge, and it is a reason that we were able to add additional counselors, both traditional counselors and also in wellness centers, to have a different job. In addition to counselors, we added social workers so that there was a real complement of opportunities for students to access resources. I think the role of counseling has changed over time, and that is one to really think about whole young people, especially those who can access resources on their own that aren't dependent on a parent, that can actually walk into a place and say, you know, I need help, and can access those services. So we were able to add additional counseling to decrease the ratio, and then also provide other kinds of supports that had not been available in our school district.
So Sean, if somebody is fortunate enough, a student, to have parents that, and some of the kids that we were talking to earlier expressed that, they had parents that helped them to sort of zero in on what needed to be done in order to be resilient, to be adaptive to the pandemic. If you're lucky and you have that, and if you go to a school district that has the funding and has the staffing to do what's necessary, you're okay, or you'll probably be okay, right? But suppose you're not. Suppose you don't have the parents who can do that. Suppose you don't go to a school district that has the funding and the staffing. What happens to you?
Well, I think that's a real challenge for society. I mean, it's not just the pandemic that creates those problems. I mean, the pandemic was sort of the collision of already existing enormous social inequality in America and a sort of catastrophic pandemic. And the combination of those two things is felt the most by the kids whose families and communities have the fewest resources. We tend to think of schools as places where kids learn to read and do math and science and things like that, but increasingly we've asked schools to do what Long Beach is doing, which is to provide mental health service and counseling service, wellness centers, as the students talked about. We've sort of expanded what we think of schools doing because we've grown aware that students really need those resources, and families don't always have the capacity to provide them. They don't have the financial resources to find those. And so we've kind of expanded the role of schools, and even more so in the pandemic, because the only social institution we have that can really touch every kid in society is the school system. So when you have this pandemic, which creates massive mental health challenges for many students, where can we go to get resources to those kids who need it? Well, we go to the schools, but that means schools need more resources to do it.
I was going to ask you, I mean, is that asking too much? And Jill, you may want to jump in on this. I mean, it seems like you're asking, when I say you, but it seems like it's asking a lot for a school system, especially depending on, as I said earlier, how affluent the district happens to be, the staffing of the district, a whole range of variables. It seems like a lot to ask. Is it, both of you?
It is. If we didn't have so much inequality in society, if we didn't have high poverty communities, we wouldn't necessarily have to ask the school systems to step in this way. But in part because we have so much inequality, we rely a lot on schools to help out kids in those poorest communities because they're the one public institution we have. It's a lot to ask, but it's not a lot to ask because schools are a problem. It's a lot to ask because social inequality is a problem.
Jill, a lot to ask or too much to ask?
A lot to ask. Interesting perspective that we hold in Long Beach Unified is that about 2/3 of our students live below the poverty line. And what we experienced was a tremendous difference in how schools and families in the city experienced the pandemic. And I think on the best day, a school is the hub of a community. It's the place where celebrations happen. It's the place where learning, it's the place where families convene. On the worst day, which is what was happening in the pandemic, it becomes a shutdown place, but a school district trying to feed hundreds of thousands of students each and every day, millions of meals served out of carts, out of cafeterias, trying to provide access to all kinds of health services for families. And so we became an organization that went far from its mission in service to our families in things that we never knew how to do, that were nothing like teaching a student how to read or teaching a student how to be prepared for an AP test. We became a place that wanted to support all families, but in ways that we had never had to do and actually didn't have the expertise to be able to do, and had to really learn our way into what we could do.
Gary, what happens in terms of the applications that you'll be getting over the next couple of years and have already started to get when we see even more of this split in who suffered more of the learning loss and whose grades went down more? I mean, is it just the affluent kids that are going to have the grades to get into big universities? What do we do here?
No, I think there are a couple layers of assumptions there that I would push back on a little bit. I think, no doubt, students who come from low-income backgrounds and, living in a studio apartment with, 4 or 5 people in one room and questionable access to the internet.
How do you
students,
study? Right?
Yeah, exactly. A quiet space, students sitting in parking lots of Walmarts to get internet access. Like these are very real challenges that these students experienced. But I don't want to imply that students who maybe come from more resources didn't experience challenges as well. They certainly did. Health challenges, loss of family members, everybody being in the house and being on top of each other. Like these are things that students across the board really experienced. And I think we're seeing that present itself in the college application. I think, much like you heard our students earlier saying, students have an incredible ability to tell their stories and talk about the challenges that they've experienced. And it's heartbreaking. Like this is an emotional process for us because we can identify, we went through this pandemic too. Young people, middle-aged people, older people, we all experienced this pandemic together, maybe in very different ways depending on our circumstances. So it's something that I think we will continue to see present itself in college applications, not only in perhaps student performance and learning, but in the stories that we hear from students about the challenges that they experienced, how they overcame those challenges. And I guess I think of it, I try to look at this through a positive lens of, yes, there's been some loss and challenges, but wow, these students are just incredibly resilient, and they're going to be, I think, students who come to college campuses and really demand the kind of support that we should have been providing to our students for a long time. And it's something that I think is you wish none of us had to go through this, but I think these students, as we heard with these stories earlier, are really ready to focus forward and really apply themselves to their future.
Chito, so we've talked about what schools need to do and what students can rightfully, I suppose, demand their schools do because of the pandemic and to try to make up any deficiencies they have. Do students have a right to demand of businesses that businesses do something to help them? And is that a fair, traditionally a young person goes for a job, the question the employer has is, what can you do for me and my company? Do students now have the right to go to a business and say, yeah, but what can you do for me?
Okay, so let me just make sure I share the true importance here that depending on where the employer is, public or private, there are more luxuries in one versus the other, okay? When it comes down to the expectations of a private business, they can decide who is two things. They're going to decide, can you make money for the company or can you save money for the company? That's what an employer wants. right? And so what we need to do is teach our students how they can contribute to the bottom line. But on the flip side, we need to teach our students how they can, make the processes more efficient, more effective, and thus saving the bottom line. That's where a lot of these employers that I work with right now, they tell us what the skills that they are looking for, the skilled talent, what they're looking for. But within the technical skills, they need proof on individuals being able to get along, follow leadership, all those things that we're already being taught, but we have to be able to prove it. So this is where we need to ask the same questions over and over again so it sticks. Sometimes it'll take that one more question before it sticks in the mind of a young person. But to get back to what you were asking earlier about what can we do enough? Is it too much of a pull? I think counseling is a perfect example of what needs to get to the next level. For so many years, so many decades, we've heard about academic counseling. But what about career counseling? Can there be a blend of academic and career counseling? Sure, there has to be. Because not everybody wants to stay in education. They want to go somewhere, a job and career. If our counseling is only showing what the educational pathway is, but not adding career advice, then we may only be touching half of the coin.
What should the business know about this incoming generation, about these kids to young adults? Because there's always generational things in offices, and there's always friction. What do they need to know now about this new crop of people?
I'll tell you one thing. A lot of the questions revolve around what have you done to adapt to? What have you done that you can bring to the floor of the employer, right? Talk about resiliency and adaptability. That's great because that's the kind of world that we live in from the private sector. They want the new ideas, but they also expect, innovative ways to get to the new ways of generating revenue. So as a new employee, you have to be able to prove that you've actually done it. This is the one major thing that we always teach students through my class at the School of Ed at LMU. We teach them you have to prove who you worked for, what you've done, and where you've done it. At the hiring table, this is what I teach my students. At the hiring table, they're not going to ask how many paragraphs you've read. They're going to ask, what have you done, where have you done it, and who have you done it with? So if what we're doing at LA Trade Tech, at LMU, we're trying to take it up a notch, all the internships, all the work experiences, because we want those classroom knowledge to be added onto with a layer of experience. And that's what employers will be wanting.
Let me ask you, because we're getting to the end of our broadcast, and we're going to ask you to keep your answers on this question brief, but I also don't want you to give a knee-jerk answer to this question, but I'd like you all, one after another, to give me an answer to it. Are you optimistic or not about this? Someone earlier, one of the kids said that they feel it's a generation defined by the pandemic. So if that's the case, are you optimistic or not about that generation? Jill, start with you.
I am super optimistic, and I have spent a lot of time in the last even 6 months out having lunch with high school students and talking about some of our survey data that is survey about their wellness. And what I'm hopeful about is that not only it may take them longer to recover academically, but what they're taking out into the world is an absolute passion for doing something that makes the world a better place, taking up social justice issues in a way that I have not seen from the previous generations, and really what they're going to, the optimism that they hold. And while there might have been learning loss, there was also life learning that did happen. And I'm really optimistic about the students and what they will do to change the world that's in front of us.
Sean?
I would say I'm mixed. I'm optimistic in the sense that there's been a lot of attention to the education system as a result of this, and that's caused lots of policymakers and educators and community leaders to sort of think hard about what our school systems need to help these kids, and I think that's positive and it's going to lead to positive changes. I'm a little pessimistic because I don't think that conversation is focused enough on kind of remedying the inequality that got exacerbated by the pandemic. And so if we don't really pay attention to the inequality piece of it, we're going to end up sort of baking that extra inequality into this generation for the rest of their lives.
Gary?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think overall I'm very optimistic. I think this generation of students, especially having experienced what they have as a result of the pandemic, they are vocal, they are engaged, they have expectations, they're willing to share those expectations, and they're very demanding of the communities that they're a part of to be better. And they're willing to engage in that work. It's not just saying it out loud, it's being willing to do the work and engage in ways to, as Jill said, kind of make the world around them a better place in spite of the challenges that they've experienced. So I find myself being very encouraged by these students.
And Cheeto?
I'm very optimistic in that the students are so fast in learning, so open to new ideas. They just have to open up and be able to do those things that normal people want you to do, such as walking up to people and saying hello. It happened right outside in the green room. You know, a student walks up to all of us and said hello. That kind of skill is so important because, you know, you can have so much knowledge, but if you aren't able to articulate it, then you're going to be left behind. So I think when it comes down to it, optimistic towards the students, realistic towards the infrastructure of education, we got to do a better job.
It's like a 3.5 out of 4.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Thank you all so much for coming in.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on this town hall, Generation Lost. If you missed any of the show, it is available on demand, knxnews.com. The video is right there, knxnews.com/townhall. Thank you again to CalHOPE, our sponsor, for their support in putting this all together. For Charles Feldman, I'm Mike Simpson.
This has been a special presentation of KNX News 97.1 FM.
A Generation Lost, a KNX News Town Hall, is available on demand at knxnews.com/townhall and on the free Audacy app.